Dr. Lundgren is a researcher in the Center of Middle Eastern Studies there in Lund University, and we are honored to host him as an invited lecturer here in Yerevan State University, Faculty of Oriental Studies. And Dr. Lundgren is mainly focused, his work is mainly focused on Assyrians, a very unique nation which is too close to us and in the same time it is too far from us. So today's lecture is particularly for us, for Turkologists, is very interesting because Dr. Lundgren is going to cover the issues of Assyrians in modern Turkey. So it is a very interesting topic and not so much analyzed and discussed. So Dr. Lundgren, the floor is yours. We'll be honored to listen to your lecture. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Marushan, for kind words once again, and good to see you, everyone. Yes, I'm going to talk for a while, hopefully not for too long. I have the problem that when I get started, it's very difficult to stop me, but I try to not to go on for ages. I really want this to be also kind of dialogue, so if you have something you would like to ask or comment, you can do it anytime. You don't have to wait till the end of the lecture to ask your questions, but feel free to do it at any time. As told, it will be today, my topic is the Assyrians in Turkey. And in fact, there are so few Assyrians in Turkey, so you could ask why talk a whole lecture about such a small community. But it is historically a very substantial community. The fact that they are so few today that's one point. But the other point is that many of the Assyrians, for example, in Sweden, where I live, they have a background in Turkey. So what's going on there reflects on the Assyrian diaspora, because so many in the diaspora have their background in Turkey. There are mainly two locations in Turkey where there have been for centuries a substantial number of Assyrians. And one of them is the Hakkari Mountains in the real southeast of Turkey, which for centuries was the stronghold of the Church of the East, one of the traditional Assyrian churches. But during the genocide in 1915, this whole community left the Hakkari Mountains. First to go to Urmia in Persia, and later they moved to Iraq. After the genocide, after the First World War, a few thousand of these Assyrians, they tried to move back to their villages in the Hakkari Mountains, but they were chased away by the Turkish army in 1924. So now for 95 years, there have not been Assyrians in the Hakkari Mountains at all. And that's why I'm not going to talk about that, but to talk about the other location with a substantial Assyrian community for centuries, and that is the Tur Abdin area, which is to the west of Hakkari. And whereas Hakkari Mountains was a stronghold of the Church of the East, the Tur Abdin area is or has been the stronghold of the Syriac Orthodox Church, which is the traditional church of West Assyrians. Okay, this is the Tur Abdin area. There is the quite, well, not big, but anyway, a city, Mardin, is technically not part of the Tur Abdin, but very close. And then in the real Tur Abdin area, there is one town, that is Midyat, and then several villages. Many of these villages, they were for centuries inhabited completely by Assyrians. There are also, as you see the crosses, there are several old monasteries, many of them still functioning as monasteries. The word Tur Abdin, it's a Syriac word. It means mountain of the servants. And the servants are, of course, the servants of God, because there were so many monasteries here, so many monks, and therefore servants of God. And it's been for ages a stronghold of the Syriac Orthodox Church. One of the cities here is on the border to Syria, is Nisibis, or today's Nusaybin. It's a very, I will very shortly a little history background of these places, and then my focus will be on the situation today. Nisibis was together with Edessa, later called Urfa, two very central Christian centers for the young church. And there was a churchman called Jacob of Nisibis who lived in the early 4th century. He was called the Moses of Mesopotamia and was a very important church, Syriac church father. And he died when the city was conquered by the Persians. And he was the spiritual father of another even more famous church father, Ephraim the Syrian, which he is the most famous, the most influential church father in the Syriac tradition, and especially as a hymn writer. He had to leave Nisibis for Edessa, where he was part of a very important theological school. They sometimes claim that this was the first university. Okay, the word wasn't used, but it was a kind of university because they were not teaching only religion and theology, but also philosophy and rhetoric and mathematics and things like that. This is Nisibis, like for centuries an extremely important city for Eastern Christianity. Today it's a complete Kurdish city with almost no Christian inhabitants left. The oldest monastery in Turabdin is called Mor Gabriel. It was founded already in 397. It's probably the oldest monastery in the world. It had its golden era from the 7th to the 13th century, where 1,500 monks were living, monks and students, some who young students who later would become monks. But it has been destroyed, and especially it has been looted several times during history by Persians and by Kurds, and especially by Timur Lenk, the Central Asian ruler who destroyed many cities and communities during his military campaigns that lasted for decades. Today, what is left from this ancient monastery is there is a bishop there, a few monks. When I was there some years ago, there were 3 monks, maybe 2, 3, 4, about 20 nuns, and then 40 children, like students who they stay in the monastery. They go to a Turkish school, but in the monastery they get education in their own language and own religion. It has become, interestingly enough, a great tourist attraction, especially among Turks. And there are tourist buses coming to this place just to see it. And it has had constant legal struggles for its land since 2008, because there was a decision for the Turkish state to confiscate some of its lands. And there has been several court decisions, sometimes in favor of the monastery and sometimes not in the favor of the monasteries. This is a picture of that place. It's a huge building still, and it has been renovated, so it's a very nice place to visit. Another famous monastery in the region is called Deirul Safaran, which means the saffron monastery. Its official name is Morhananyo, but everybody calls it the saffron monastery. It's very close to the town of Mardin, 3 kilometers outside. It was founded in 493, and it was for almost 800 years. It was the seat of the patriarch of the Syriac Orthodox Church. Then in 1932, he had to leave and move to Syria. So now the patriarch is in Damascus. Today in this monastery, what's left, there's a bishop there, a few functionaries helping the bishop with different things, and some students. I don't know the exact number of the students. This is a picture of, it's also a quite impressive, huge building that has been renovated. So although it's old, it is in quite good shape, in fact. These are the two oldest, biggest, most famous monasteries, but there are several other monasteries left. Okay, the Seifo is the Assyrian name for the genocide, 1915 genocide. The Sanjak of Mardin is mainly the town of Mardin and the Turabdin area. And those who say disappeared most probably were killed or maybe escaped by moving somewhere else, where almost 60% of the Assyrian Christians. Among the Armenian Christians living in Mardin, it was even more, it was over 90% who were killed. But also many of the Assyrian Christians were killed, but not all. Say 40% survived, and they continued to live. So unlike in Hakkari, where nothing was left, here in fact there were some 20,000-30,000 who continued to live in the villages. So the genocide was not the end of the story of this community. Life returned to some kind of normal, but with constant problems, tensions, both with Turkish authorities and with local Kurds. Because this is a complete Kurdish area. The only Turks who are living here are like officials, whereas the local people are Kurds. And of course the Kurds have increased in numbers. So they are more and more influential, also in the villages that used to be completely Christian, Assyrian. It's now mixed or Kurdish. And when in the 20th century, they had specific problems, the Assyrians in Turabdin. And one was that according to the Lausanne Treaty in 1923, there are 3 official minorities in Turkey. And they are the Jews, the Armenians, and the Greeks. The Assyrian Syriani didn't get a status of an official minority. And that has meant, for example, that they don't have the right to have schools of their own. Whereas the Jews, the Greeks, and the Armenians, they do have schools. I think there are some 16 Armenian schools in Istanbul today, but there's not one Assyrian school. So that's why the kids, the boys, especially in Mor Gabriel monastery, they go every morning to a Turkish school. And then outside school hours, they get education in their own language and in their own religion. And this is accepted by the authorities, but not to have a school of their own where they would teach everything like according to how they had to go to this Turkish school. Then, as you all know, the Republic of Turkey has had, since it was founded 95 years ago, like a constant policy of Turkification. They're trying to Turkify its population. And one example of this was the name law in 1934, where all people were ordered to change, if they had a non-Turkish name, they had to change that name to a Turkish name. I know that the Assyrians in Turabdin, they were extremely scared, the men, they were scared of the military service, because they understood, they had heard from older men that it was a tough time often for Christians to do the military service. They could be harassed openly by officers and so. But most of them survived, but it was a problem for them. And then every time there was some kind of a crisis in the world, where you would have, say, an Islamic part confronting a Christian part, that could mean problems also for Assyrians in Turabdin. And this is especially true for the Cyprus crisis, both the one in 1964 and the one 10 years later. And I have good friends in Sweden who are Assyrians from Tur Abdin, and they are old enough to remember these incidents. And they have told me that, you know, I was a small kid then, and we were very uneducated, simple people. We didn't even know that there existed a place called Cyprus. And all of a sudden, the Muslims would tell us, oh, you Christians are killing Muslims in Cyprus, so now you have to pay the price for that. Well, in Cyprus, where's that? I mean, they had absolutely nothing to do with this conflict in Cyprus. But still, there were incidents where they were threatened. Fortunately, this did not escalate to massacres or violence, but there was everybody who has experienced this, they remember it very well, that they were really scared that something bad would happen because there were so many threats against them. Okay, then we come to the
so when you were talking about the Turkification, we talked about changing names, but was there a rule to change their religion, and after becoming Muslim, would they treat Assyrians differently, so like as they would treat their own Turks or something? Right.
This is this Islamization issue. I would say that I think the experiences of Christians living in Turkey in the 20th century have been different, but all have experienced in one way or another that things would be easier if you belong to the majority population, by assimilating, by converting to Islam, by adopting a Turkish identity. And in fact, many did that under force during the genocide. After the genocide, there were no like forceful Islamization. People were told that convert or we will kill you. Nothing like that happened. But there was some kind of social pressure and knowledge of that things would be easier for you if you were not a Christian. But in Tur Abdin, it's very remote. It's far from Istanbul. People were mostly living their lives in the local village. But those who had, say, more like social mobility, those who moved to Istanbul, those who they probably experienced more that for my career, for my opportunities, it would be better for me not to belong to a minority community and to be Christian, or in the eyes of some people an infidel. Yeah. So some kind of social pressure, yes, but no forceful Islamization, I would say. Yeah.
To continue the topic, are there any Assyrians which conceal their identities? You see, in case of us, Armenians, there are lots of Armenians living in Turkey which just conceal their identity.
Exactly. Yeah.
They know that they are Armenians.
Yep. I mentioned this yesterday, but I will mention it again. You know, there is, for those who were here yesterday, repetitio mater studiorum est is Latin, which means that repetition is the mother of knowledge. So yes, you all know that during the genocide, there were thousands, even tens of thousands of Christian women especially, mostly Armenian, but also to a certain extent Assyrian women that were abducted. Even small girls, teenagers and young adult women were abducted. They were Islamized, forced to convert, forced to marry a Turkish man or a Kurdish man. The young girls had to work in the house, and when she grew up, she was married to a Muslim man and so on. These women, most of them, they kept their secret like secret. They didn't tell anybody. They didn't even tell their children that I was in fact born as an Armenian or as an Assyrian. in many cases, they didn't tell their grandchildren about it. But in some cases, the truth was revealed late in life. And today, there is an estimate that there will be like 2 million Turks who in fact have a Christian grandmother. Many of them don't know about it, some do know about it. And when it comes to Turabdin and this area, there are today a growing movement of people openly talking about the fact that, okay, I have, my ancestors used to be Assyrians, but then they were Islamized. And there is in Diyarbakir, there is a group, they have a Facebook group called Muslim Assyrians, Müslüman Süryaniler, and with hundreds of members. And these people, they normally say, okay, I am a Muslim, but I know that my ancestors, they were Assyrians. I'm not going to convert. I'm going to remain a Muslim. But at the same time, I want to claim my Assyrian heritage, Assyrian history. I want to learn more about Assyrians. I want to learn the language and so. So they encourage each other to really, to learn more about this. But most of them don't have the intention of going all in, like by converting and joining an Assyrian church. So yeah, we do have these cases. It's a completely similar story with the Armenians, especially in Diyarbakir. There are Islamized Armenians who are now learning the language and learning about the Armenian history. And some have gone all in. I mean, I have read stories about these Islamized Armenians from Turkey coming to Armenia also to get to know Eastern Armenia. And some have, when they have been here, they have gone to Echmiadzin and they have been baptized there and things like that. So yes, we do have these, say, hidden Assyrians or Islamized Assyrians who kept silent for many, many decades. But now the situation has been a little bit more open. So it has been easier for them to now come out of the closet, so to say.
And is there any pressure by the government on these people to prevent their recourse?
I don't think that there is pressure from the government. Maybe if they would in larger number like go all in and also convert or say reconvert, there might be problem from their families and so, because this is always a very sensitive issue, a Muslim like a Muslim leaving Islam and so on. But I don't think, because when it comes to the Muslim Assyrians, they are so few. So that is not a very big headache for the government, I would say. All right. Okay, let's move to the 1980s, because then things got really bad in Turabdin because of the Kurdish crisis. There was soon a full-scale war between the PKK and the Turkish army. And the Assyrians were like squeezed in between. By the Turkish army, they were often accused of having their sympathies with PKK, and by PKK, they were accused of collaborating with the Turkish army against them and so on. There were more than 50 Assyrians in the villages in Turabdin that were killed in the 1980s and 90s, and not even one of these murders was solved. Nobody was put to justice for these incidents. And yeah.
Clarification: they were killed during civilian attack or something like that, or they were part
assassinated. Very often assassinated, and very often they were like not ordinary people, but they were some village heads or yeah, exactly, or people from, say, an influential leader of a big family and things like that. And this violence now, the result was, of course, naturally, intensified emigration. There had been emigration already before this, but now in much larger waves. And people left for Istanbul and for Europe, especially Germany and Sweden. And the fact is that today there are many more Assyrians living in Istanbul than in Turabin. But I'm not going to talk about them because for Assyrians, Istanbul is diaspora. Even if it's the same country, Turkey, it's not the Assyrian homeland. Turabin is part of the historic homeland of Assyrians. Istanbul is something completely different. It's really diaspora. But this really led to a huge wave. I mean, we are now talking about tens of thousands who left. Here are some statistics, like 2 villages, one called Mziza. See, in 1970, there were 200 families. It's a completely Assyrian village. 200 families were living in 1970 there. 10 years later, 42 families. Today, less than 10 families are left. Another village, Ainvardo, is a very famous village because that is one of the few villages where during the genocide, the Assyrians were able to put up a successful resistance. It's like a Mossadegh of Assyrians. And you see, 1962, 300 families. 1985, 150, and today less than 10. And these are just 2 examples. The numbers are pretty much similar in most of these villages. So it's really a huge depopulation of these villages. And some of the villages, they have been abandoned, they have been empty. In others, Kurds have moved in. So in Ainvardo now, there are still hundreds of families, but almost all of them are Kurdish families. A town, maybe a little technically, slightly to the east of Turabin, is called Asakh. In 1964, this little town had 3,500 inhabitants, all of them Assyrians, not one Kurd. In the 1970s and 80s, then the immigration started, and when Assyrians were leaving, Kurds were moving in. In 1994, the former Assyrian mayor was killed on the street. And this was like a signal to the Assyrians that see what happens. And today, there are 30,000 inhabitants, almost all are Kurds. There are less than 100 Assyrians left. So say from 3,500 to 50. It's also a huge demographic change. So today, according to a study 4 years ago, there are only 1,765 Assyrians living in Midyat and in some of these villages. But the monasteries are functioning. There are many churches where there is a priest and there are church services. So in a way, Assyrian life goes on. It's not completely lost, but the numbers of people who are there has dwindled. And there has been some, I will talk about this repatriation. There has been some efforts of getting those who left in the 70s and 80s to get back. And on June 12, 2001, the then Prime Minister Bülent Ecevit, he issued a statement in which he invited the Assyrians from Turabin to come back. It's a very interesting statement because how he formulates this invitation to come back. He doesn't say that, okay, this is your historic homeland. You have lived here for centuries. It was a wrongdoing that things happened so that you had to leave, but now we are happy to welcome you back. That would have been, say, a human rights discourse, saying that you have the right to live here, but because of historical wrongdoings, you are not living here, but please come back. You belong to this land. No, the statement was not like that. The statement was more like this. In Europe, they are saying that the Assyrians, they are not welcome in their historic homeland in Turkey. And we don't like that this image of Turkey is spread in the world, so please come back. It was completely about the image of Turkey. That European newspapers were writing more and more about these people who had to leave Turkey and who don't feel safe to go home. So he wanted to do something about this image problem and invited them to come back. Okay, anyway, many Assyrians thought, okay, why not? And especially in Germany, they established return associations. Like people who had come from one village, they joined together, they established an organization, and then they found out what would be the possibilities. What if we go back there to our houses, rebuild them, and so on. And then we see, for some years here, like 10, 15 years, there was a kind of repatriation or renaissance. Many of the old monasteries were now reopened and renovated. Some who hadn't been there they left in the 80s, they hadn't been back even once. Now they returned to the village. Met with some people they knew, looked at the house where they used to live and so on. And some even returned to live in these villages. And they even started to publish a monthly magazine for Assyrians living in Tur Abdin, writing up news about what's going on in the villages when they are renovating houses and things like that. So it looked a little bit hopeful that maybe a substantial number of those who left would in fact return to their villages and rebuild life there. But, okay, the real main example of this return was a village called Kafro, which was abandoned. The last inhabitant in Kafro, he left, or family, they left in 95. And then the village was abandoned. No Kurds moved in. It was a completely empty village. In 2004, some of those who left returned and started constructing. And now it has about 20 houses, 20 families living there. There's a small chapel, there's a restaurant. It has become a pioneer village because there's nothing of the old. In other villages, you have old houses and then a few newly reconstructed or renovated. But this is a completely rebuilt village. They're in the real heartland of Tur Abdin. And this was seen like, okay, I mean, what is it said in this famous song about New York? If you can make it here, you can make it everywhere. Like, if they can do it in that village, why not in other villages as well? But then we can say that this campaign of returning to Tur Abdin, it failed. There's a report about that by a German scholar named Susanne Güsten, who was connected to the Istanbul Policy Center, and it's called Farewell to Tur Abdin, because some returned, but then they had to say farewell. And the main reason for the failure was the re-escalation of the Kurdish war in 2015. Then it became too difficult for many to live there, and especially for those who were thinking about moving there to do that. But there are also other reasons, and one is a German nationality law. That is, most of those who returned were German citizens. And now when they wanted to live permanently in Turkey and also to become Turkish citizens. But Germany doesn't allow double citizenship. So to get Turkish citizenship, they had to renounce the German citizenship. And they didn't want that, because the German passport was some kind of insurance that if things get bad, we can always move back. So had Germany allowed for double citizenship, we would probably have seen much more people moving in here. Then there have been cases of land confiscation by the Turkish state. So many felt that, okay, they wanted us to come back, and while we are, then when we are here, they treat us like this. They discriminate us. We see these land grabs. And it was also a cultural shock for children. You can imagine if you are born in Germany, you start to go to school in Germany, and then when you are 10 or 11, your family move to Turabdin, which is a quite simple, poor area of Turkey. And you are put in the local school together, and maybe there are 40 in the classroom. All are Kurds, and education is in Turkish. It was a cultural shock. And the fact is that those children who moved with their parents back to Turabdin, when they were 18, all except for one moved back to Germany. So it was especially difficult for children, because the parents, they had memories of life there. They knew Turkish. The children, they didn't have any connection, personal connection, any memories of living. They hadn't been living there.
How many people were there?
I think there, in fact, were probably a few thousand altogether at one point. Yes. At least several hundreds, and probably more than 1,000. But this is also moving back, means many have moved back in the way that they have rebuilt their house in the village, but they continue to live in Germany. And then like 3 or 4 or 6 months of the year, they stay in the village, and then in the winter they go back to Germany. So they have not permanently moved there, but they have reconnected to their village. Those who permanently live there are fewer, but those who kind of stay there for at least some part of the year are more.
Just to add, we have nearly the same situation with the last Armenian village in Turkey, Vakıflı, which is the Musaller
exactly.
district, and there are, in winter we have nearly 200 people living there permanently, and during the summer it is becoming a typical Armenian city from Armenia. Like 3,000, 4,000 people is spending their let's say vacation or holidays in Musaller. So it's a big village, but in fact it's not a big village.
Okay, right. Yeah, I think it's pretty similar here also.
They are actually coming from Germany.
Yeah. There are some from Sweden, some from Switzerland, but most of these are, for some reason, this repatriation movement was strong, especially strong in Germany, stronger there than in Sweden, for example. And then there have been also harassments and incidents with the Kurds. Some of them here. There is a place in Turabdin called Tur Islo. Tur means mountain. It's the Islo mountain. There are a few Assyrian villages and no Kurdish villages in that area. And there, of all places, the PKK decided to build a martyrs cemetery there. Why don't they build it in a Kurdish village? Why build it in the midst of small Assyrian villages? And then, of course, when there was a new war, violence escalated in 2015, the Turkish army, of course, bombed this PKK cemetery in an Assyrian village. There was, in May 2016, there was a PKK attack against the Turkish army. But once again, the Turkish army is everywhere. So you can attack them in many locations. But they chose to attack the Turkish army in the Assyrian village of Hah, and in fact so close to the local church that the local church was damaged in this bomb attack. And many Assyrians thought that this was not by chance. They deliberately wanted to do this attack in an Assyrian village. So not only to do harm to the Turkish army, but also to send a signal to the local Assyrians that, okay, this is Kurdish lands. there's so much negative things here, so a few positive signals. The university in Mardin, they some 7-8 years ago, they started to teach Syriac studies. That is especially the language and also the culture. They openly said, okay, this area has been very multicultural. So let's now embrace all the different cultures that have been here. So we will also have like university level education in the Syriac language and Syriac studies. The woman in picture here, Febronia Akyol, she was in fact the co-mayor of Mardin from 2014 to 2016. And the fact that a Christian woman could be elected to this position was of course a positive signal. But she was, then you know, when the government, they sacked many of these Kurdish mayors and Kurdish local leaders, so she had to go also in 2016 after the coup attempt. Last year, in the beginning of last year, there was decision by the government that 56 ecclesiastical assets, that means like buildings belonging to the church, that had been confiscated by the state, would be returned to the Syriac Orthodox Church. But we don't know, is this the beginning of a new approach, or are these like only incidents with no further significance? Okay, I will. Okay, if you have something to ask about this, the situation in Tur Abdin, about the repatriation process, then do it now. Otherwise, I will move.
So you have another part of...
Yeah, I have a little left, not very much.
Can listen
Okay, yeah, right. Because a few years ago, there was an interesting book was published called Religious Minorities in Turkey, where they had also made like a questionnaire study asking the same questions to representative groups of 3 minorities, that is the Alevis, Assyrians, and Armenians. And here are some results from that study. I think they're quite interesting. One question was, how strong is your identity as a minority? And this is, I mean, 5 means extremely strong, 1 means no, it's not, I don't have any such identity. And you see, the yellow staple is Alevis, the blue is Alevis, the yellow is Assyrians, and then what is probably white is Armenians. And all these minorities, they have a very strong minority identity. And the most strongest identity is for the Assyrians. Then, how strong is your identity as a Turkish citizen? And you see, much weaker. And especially the Assyrians have a very weak identity as Turkish citizens. Then they were asked that how strong is your identity based on different things, based on religion, based on culture and so on. And interesting, the religion, it's especially strong for the Assyrians. And yeah, I don't know how to, you can help me, how should we interpret that fact? Also, in every aspect, culture, history, ethnicity, the strongest minority identity you find among the Assyrians. And yeah, ethnicity, yeah, Alevis are a religious minority. It's not an ethnic minority, so they don't have a very strong ethnic identity. But interestingly enough, they don't have a very strong religious identity either, the Alevis. It's very...
They are religious.
Yeah, interesting point. The Alevis is a religion, but Alevis are very secular. They are often very leftist and secular. So that's why they don't have a strong religious identity, although they are a religious minority by definition. So.
This study has been conducted in the Mardin region or In the whole Turkey?
In the whole, for Armenians mostly in Istanbul, for Alevis in all over the country, and for Assyrians in the Turabdin region. And that is also one reason for this. People in cities are more secular than people in villages. In villages you live a very traditional life, you go to church and blah blah. That's okay. Let's look at this. This is in percent. Acceptance of mixed marriages. And look at the Assyrians here. Like almost 90% say that they don't accept mixed marriages. Whereas, yeah, you see very different numbers for both Alevis and Armenians. And with mixed marriages, here is not meant marriages between Assyrians and Armenians, but marriages with Muslims. And okay, once again, Assyrians are living in small villages or small towns, whereas Armenians, for example, they live in the city of Istanbul. And also the Assyrians, they are so few that they cannot lose a single member of their community, and they think that with a mixed marriage they lost. The children of that mixed marriage will not be Assyrians anymore, they will be Turks or Kurds, Muslims. So that's why they are so completely against mixed marriages. Okay, then they were asked about the relation to the Turkish state and people. And one question, this is once again, 5 means very much, 1 means nothing at all. And here the numbers are, say, between 2.5 and 3.5, somewhere in the middle. Not very much confidence, but still some. And interestingly enough, you look at the Alevis, they have confidence in Turks, but they are not satisfied with the relation to the Turkish state. So they make this distinction between the Turkish people that they trust and the Turkish state that they think is very much against us. Whereas for Assyrians, Armenians, it's not a very big difference about trust in people and trust in the state, so to say. Okay, then they ask about social integration, but how well are you integrated when into your own community? And you see very high numbers. And that means that if you are an Assyrian, you have a lot of Assyrian friends, and you socialize mainly with family and friends from your own community. Then with the majority society, and once again, Assyrians, they have less social contacts with majority society of all these groups, because they live in their own villages and stick to each other. And once again, the numbers are between, what is it, 2.5 and 3.5, so somewhere in the middle, not very much social interaction. Then they were asked, do you have experiences of discrimination? And you say, yes, I experience discrimination very often or often, sometimes rarely. And interestingly, the most discriminated group here, I mean, when it comes to how they feel themselves, seems to be the Alevis. Almost 80% of them say, yes, very often or often I have experienced discrimination. Armenians have experienced the least discrimination of this group. Right. This was like discrimination, like structural discrimination when it comes to careers and jobs and so on. Then harassment. Have you experienced harassment because you belong to a minority? And one question was obstruction of religious practice. And what is it? Between 3 and 3.5. Not very much, but still some. And then this pressure to Islamize. And especially Alevis have experienced that. And that is because Alevism is not, from the Muslim majority in Turkey, Alevism is not considered to be a a real religion. Like you are Muslims. You have just fooled up your concept of Islam. So please leave all this thing and become a real Muslim. That's like the attitude. Whereas Armenians and Assyrians are definitely considered to be like infidels. And, yeah. Okay. So these are quite interesting statistics about how they feel. And yeah, I don't know how to interpret these things. You can see that they are not very satisfied with how the situation is. They feel that there is discrimination, there is harassment. They don't identify with the Turkish state. They really have a strong identity of being the other, being a minority, something different from the majority population. And of course, that is no surprise whatsoever, I think. Okay, conclusion. Very recently, the Assyrian Confederation of Europe, I think in fact last week or 2 weeks ago, they published a report, Human Rights, 2018 Human Rights Report. And this report says about Turkey, the conclusion is, the restoration of property certainly represent an important step in the right direction. However, the government's treatment of Assyrian land holdings has been inconsistent at best over the course of the past decade. It has yet to be seen if recent developments constitute a positive new trend or another promise that will be rescinded. This is the typical, I think, Christian minority experience in Turkey. There is like one step forward and 2 steps back. There are promising signals, and then after some time you could see that, okay, it wasn't that promising at all. So they are very careful, said, okay, we have seen these positive signals, but we don't yet know if it's really a game changer or not. Okay, that's about it, and now I'm eager to hear some comments or questions. Yes, please.
First of all, I would like to express our gratitude for your very interesting and informative lecture. And as for the question, so what do you think, basing on the information presented, will be the future of Christian and other minorities in Turkey, and particularly for the Assyrians? Right.
Yeah. Okay, it's a good question. Let me put it like this. You know, the Assyrian national movement has an ideology which is very, very clear. And that ideology is that Assyrians are a people, a nation. It's not a religious community, it's a nationhood, ethnicity. There is an Assyrian people, Assyrian nation. And that nation, like all other nations, has the right to national self-determination. So there is this basic idea of we have the right to have a free Assyria, a state of our own in our historic homeland. But when they think about it today, they imagine that maybe in the best scenario we can get some kind of Assyria, maybe not an independent state, but some political entity in northern Iraq or maybe in the Qamishli area in Syria, but not in Turabdin. The ideas of a rebirth, they are focused on some small territory in Iraq and in Syria. When it comes to the historic homeland that now is part of Turkey, that is Turabdin, they are realistic enough to know that, okay, there will never be any kind of local autonomy or anything for us there. We are so few, we are so weak. So what they want is only to keep it like alive. As long as there are some Assyrians living there, as long as there are monasteries who are functioning, we have something to return to. We can go there and show our children that this is the place where your grandparents, parents live. This is where you have your roots. That's enough. So they really hope that there would be an Assyrian presence left in Tur Abdin in the future. They don't have bigger dreams than that of a massive return or anything like that. They will be satisfied with this. Will it happen or not? It depends on what happens in Turkey. You never know. Things change so fast. If there is once again a new escalation of the war against PKK, things will be difficult. If the present government is going more and more to, I mean, it has already developed into a very authoritarian regime. If that continues, things will be difficult for all minorities and for liberal-minded Turks and so on. If, on the other hand, there would be a miracle and Turkey would develop more into a democratic system, things would be better for the minorities too. You'll never know. Ask the Turkologist about what's going to happen in Turkey. The Assyrians, they can only hope for the best. And hope that there will be something left of our people in Tur Abdin.
Any other questions? I have 3 questions, and I'll try to find them before the students. First of all, I would like to ask about the Assyrian property, not the one which is like a personal property, not houses, but more about communal property. We have the same situation with the Armenian community in Istanbul particularly, and in other cities in Turkey as well, like in Diyarbakir, in Kayseri, in Ankara. So I would like to understand, is there anything like big houses which right now are being rented to Turks or to entrepreneurs or no? My second question is about the legal status of the churches which right now are operating. Are they in a property of one certain Assyrian man, or they are community-based something? And the last question is about the amount of Assyrians. The only source for me is the Wikipedia. And
but what does it say?
It says that there are more than 20,000 Assyrians living currently in Turkey. Is that right or no? And what is the merge between Assyrians who lived in Turkey in the beginning of the Republic, in the early period, and those who are living right now? Thank you.
Right. Okay, I start with the last question because that's the easy one. I think this 20,000 might be quite correct, in fact. 20,000 is a number that is often used, and most of them are living today in Istanbul. But I didn't speak about Istanbul because, as I said, Istanbul is diaspora. It's Tur Abdin that is the historic homeland. But there many have, as I said, when the emigration started, many moved to Istanbul and even more moved abroad. But some stayed in Istanbul. They have churches there. They even got the right to open a kindergarten, a nursery. Not a school, but a nursery. That is, anyway, a beginning. And some of those who moved there have become quite successful, like in their career, businessmen and so on. So they are living a decent life in Istanbul. And they, of course, have their origins in the Tur Abdin area, but now they live there. And might be some 20,000, yes, maybe. But it's still like, probably when the Republic was established, there were like 200,000 Assyrians. So there are much more Assyrians from Turkey living in Germany and Sweden than in Istanbul even. So when it comes to this property issue, it's really a difficult question because there have been so many cases. Like, for example, the famous Mor Gabriel case was that there was a law saying that if you have land that nothing happens for 20 years, then the state can confiscate that land. And then there were Kurdish villages close that they also demanded some of the monastery land to themselves. So there were different court cases about these lands, and it's been exactly the same thing in other places also with old old property that had belonged to say, the churches especially. But most of them are gone. But there have been, as I said, last year there was this decision to give them back. But as it said here, the government's treatment of Assyrian landholding has been inconsistent. Because sometimes they said, yes, we want to give this back to you. Very good. But then the next week they can confiscate some other property. So it has not been a consistent policy here. And that might also be due to the fact that legally it's a very complicated issue, because they are not recognized as an official minority. But still the church functions there, the church owns property, and it's of course nothing illegal with the churches. But still, it's easier with the recognized minorities. They have a more clear legal status when it comes to these property issues.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Any other questions, dear students?
No.
No other questions.
Now is your chance. Okay.
I would like to thank Dr. Lundgren first of all for today's lecture.